First at 11, Deere & Company is responding to former President Donald Trump's threat to put a 200% tariff on products the company tries to sell into the U.S. Trump made the comment during a campaign stop in Pennsylvania on Monday.
John Deere is moving some production from Iowa to Mexico.
John Deere making a big change to where they manufacture their farming equipment, leading to hundreds of U.S. layoffs.
I'm just notifying John Deere right now. If you do that, we're putting a 200% tariff on everything that you want to sell into the United States.
Day by day, we're making America affordable again. Tariffs are about making America rich again. That was President Trump's promise. But on the ground, out in the fields, in machine sheds, and across factory floors, a very different reality is taking shape. Quiet, harsh, impossible to ignore, and nowhere is the damage clearer than at John Deere, an icon now feeling the pressure like never before. Welcome back to the channel. Some stories don't explode. They crack quietly beneath the surface. And that's exactly what's happening to John Deere. In early 2025, a new wave of tariffs hit the company like a slow-motion crash. The numbers sounded technical, hundreds of millions in extra costs on parts, exports, and retaliation. But the impact was painfully real. Idled plants, cut shifts, and layoffs in towns built around Deere Green. Within a year, the tariff burden ballooned toward $500 million, with nearly $100 million landing in a single quarter. Profits fell, revenue slipped, and Deere finally admitted what it had avoided saying for years. The Made in America model wasn't breaking. It was being shaken by unpredictable policy. And in rural America, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was personal. Farmers who spent decades building stability suddenly faced soaring equipment prices, unstable markets, and loans stretched to the breaking point. Many had counted on upgrading to keep their farms competitive. Tariffs simply broke that promise. As one grower put it to a local reporter, "I'm not going to spend 3 decades building this place up just to watch policy wipe it out in 3 years. I'm done betting on moving goalposts." Bankers started quietly passing on warnings from examiners. Asset values might drop, collateral might be worth less, and the cushion that kept marginal operations afloat could disappear. You didn't need a macroeconomic model to see what was happening. You just had to walk into a dealership. Where there used to be waiting lists, there were suddenly machines sitting on the lot. Where sales teams were used to negotiating between colors, green or red, Deere or Case, they were now trying to convince farmers to buy anything at all. The upgrade cycle that kept factories humming began to freeze. Instead of trading in 4- or 5-year-old equipment, producers started nursing along tractors that had already seen a decade of hard work. Repairs went up, orders went down. A market that normally pulses with seasonal rhythm went flat. It wasn't just John Deere. Competitors like Case Wine H started trimming production and cutting jobs in Midwestern plants. Tariffs on steel, components, and machinery ricocheted through the entire supply chain. With input costs jumping, manufacturers floated price increases of a few percentage points. That might not sound like much on paper, but when you're talking about a tractor that already costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, a small percentage is the difference between maybe and absolutely not. What took shape across the US and Canada wasn't a gentle slowdown, it was a stall. And once the market stalls, you get a second-level problem: uncertainty. Not just times are tough, but I have no idea what the rules will be next year. That kind of uncertainty is toxic to long-term businesses. Because the real chaos for companies like John Deere didn't come from the tariffs themselves. It came from the way they were announced. One month there was talk of tariffs on imported machinery. The next month, rumors of exemptions. A week later, a social media post hinting at 200% tariffs if any production moved out of certain US states. Some ideas never became policy, some did. All of them had to be taken seriously. Factories can't pivot on tweets. Assembly lines don't retool on the basis of rumors. So production schedules became a kind of controlled improvisation. Procurement teams scrambled to source components before the next tariff wave hit. Logistics planners tried to reroute parts through friendlier jurisdictions. Plant managers rewrote staffing plans again and again as orders whipsawed. Internally, Deere's own risk analysis started describing the U.S. not just as a high-cost market, but as a high-policy risk market. Not because of ideology, purely because the rules no longer stayed still long enough to plan around them. When that happens, any multinational with options asks the same question. Where can we still plan 10 years out instead of 10 days? For John Deere, that question kept pointing north. While U.S. policy swung unpredictably, Canada took a steadier path, fewer tariff surprises, clearer trade signals, and a government that didn't rewrite the rules overnight. When global tariffs hit, Canada negotiated key exemptions and strengthened its industrial infrastructure with stable power, better ports, and improved logistics. In short, Canada offered something the U.S. no longer consistently could: predictability. The market reflected it. American farmers pulled back sharply, but Canadian producers, especially in the West, kept buying at a steadier pace. Slower, yes, but not collapsing. For John Deere, that stability became something crucial, a reliable second anchor. That's how a new internal map started to form: not move everything to Canada, but stop relying on only one center of gravity. A multi-anchor strategy, the idea that North America's industrial future might not rest exclusively on U.S. soil, but on a network of interconnected hubs, some American, some Canadian, sharing load and spreading risk. One of the most symbolic shifts happened on the Pacific edge of the continent. In Langley, British Columbia, a once-small John Deere facility has quietly become a global hub for tracked forestry equipment, complete with its own R&D production and technical expertise. With about 100 employees, it now exports machines worldwide and operates far from the policy instability affecting U.S. plants. Across Canada, Deere's presence is even larger. Thousands of employees, a strong dealer network, and deep roots in farming and forestry communities. In provinces like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, Deere dealers are as familiar as grain elevators, relationships built over generations. And that kind of stability is exactly what a company leans on when other parts of its global footprint start to shake. As more manufacturers undertake similar assessments, a pattern is appearing at the edges of the old industrial order. Companies that once treated the U.S. as both factory and fortress are starting to hedge their bets, not abandoning American plants, but refusing to let them be the only pillar holding up their future. Canada, by contrast, has quietly evolved into a kind of industrial safe harbor, close enough to integrate with U.S. markets via the USMCA trade framework, but distinct enough to offer its own regulatory climate, its own energy profile, and its own set of incentives. From a strategic perspective, that matters. Goods built in Canada can still flow into the U.S. under North American trade rules. Yet the production risk, tariffs, sudden rule changes, unpredictable policy shock is diluted. You get access to the same continental market without walking barefoot across the same political minefield. For Deere and companies like it, shifting more operations north also means changing the composition of their cost base. Canadian plants can rely more on domestic or regionally sourced components, reducing exposure to imported parts that might get hit with the next tariff round. And in some provinces, lower industrial power costs add another competitive edge. The result isn't a dramatic overnight exodus from the U.S. It's something subtler, a slow rebalancing of where certainty lives. And that raises a bigger question, a question that goes beyond John Deere, beyond farm equipment, beyond any single company. If long-term industrial strategy is now dictated as much by policy stability as by labor or logistics, can the traditional U.S.-centric model of manufacturing keep its gravitational pull? Or will companies gradually distribute their operations across countries that still offer something resembling a stable planning horizon? Because this isn't just one firm finding one clever workaround. It may be a preview of what comes next. Imagine a world where major manufacturers treat geography not as a patriotic default, but as a portfolio. One pillar in the U.S., one in Canada, maybe another in Europe or Asia. Risk spread, dependencies diversified, no single government holding all the levers. In that world, influence does not come from shouting America first into a microphone. It comes from creating an environment where companies choose to commit, not because they're boxed in, but because staying feels safer than leaving. What's happening to John Deere right now is painful. For workers being laid off, for farmers delaying equipment purchases, for towns that depend on factories. But it is also instructive. It shows what happens when policy volatility becomes a cost in itself. When the rules of the game change so often that the most rational response is to move part of the game somewhere else. The real issue isn't whether tariffs are good or bad, it's that unpredictability is costly. And companies like Deere are now measuring that cost with cold accuracy. Whether its shift toward Canada becomes a wider trend remains to be seen. But one thing is obvious. In a world where stability is rare, countries that provide it will rise. Canada gets that. The question is whether the U.S. will relearn it. If this pulled the curtain back for you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe, because the battle over where things are built and who controls that future is only beginning.